Let me now turn to the first approach, which is the more inductive one. We typically aim for what we here call theory development. Theory is developed as part of the analysis. We rather start with what is called open coding. We look at what we find, what are the concepts, the constructs that we have in there. A comparison in empirical research where you would typically find this is to code narrative interviews. Yeah? Where you have a certain material, you are not too sure on what you would find, and then you would basically try to get started. And the challenge is that not really knowing where to get started, it is also hard to predict on where you would end up. So it's developing the things out of the material. Quite often this takes a lot of time, and you might typically go via several loops, if you have seen them on the previous slide. So you might have to return in the analysis to the material, make sense, explain, understand, return to the material. So it's really these kind of loops play an important role accordingly. The example that I have here is the topic of social issues in supply chain management. When we started with it, we really saw the field as rather open. We did not really have an idea on what kind of constructs are there already for using it, and therefore we did so. But it was a lengthy process, and let me honestly mention it took us 2 to 3 years to really come up with what I then show you briefly as the outcome. Yeah, it relates to some of the issues that you would also typically find in ICDD related search terms. The methodology in this particular case, keywords specified here, so we used CSR, corporate social responsibility. We also just used social issues, sustainability, social, supply chain, and combined them. So we typically had a word more on the social side and another word more on the supply chain side, and then analyzed it. We restricted ourselves to papers appearing in English language peer-reviewed journals because we had enough of this already. We used typical databases. Science Direct is basically Scopus, but we then also looked at some other databases to broaden this body of literature. To show you some of the descriptive findings here, we ended up with 142 papers. That's rather at the upper edge of what you can handle. We then tried to look at, do we have some categories that we can work with? The categories that we started to work with were not so useful, so we rather really turned to the material and worked from inside the material. Here's a part of a descriptive analysis just to illustrate this. Do you see the distribution of papers across the time period? And you see that we have a certain peak, which we found hard to explain. In some cases, easy explanations for such patterns is that you would have had a special issue on a topic, which then points to the fact that it basically shoots up and you see the idea basically coming up there. Yeah. This is now the outcome. And as said, it took us minimum 2 years and turning to several conferences to present ideas there, to get feedback and make sense of it. I'll very briefly sum this up a little. So we have the social issues being driven by either external stakeholders, NGOs, unions, and so on, demanding certain things. We also have internal stakeholders. Don't underestimate what's also workers, and particularly if they are unified in certain unions, can do. And then we see that companies react to this with what we call responsible supply chain actions. The simplest form is basically the companies communicate, we do something good. If you watch TV at the moment, you always see this all over. At the moment, it's really a hype. But what is sometimes quite positive about is if the companies actually do so, then they realize, actually we have to do something about compliance. So this is the next strategy. Yeah. We then see that inside compliance, they set up what is called code of conducts or certain standards. They do some auditing and monitoring of suppliers. So they turn to their supply chain and look at what's actually happening there and try to really get this right. And once they do so, then they realize, oh, there's something going on in our suppliers and we might actually work with our suppliers, so that is the next step. Yeah. We simplify this here a bit. So we put it at the 1, 2, 3 level of approaches. In reality, of course, this will intermingle and this will overlap. what you want to aim for, and that is what the outcomes here are, is you want to have social improvements, you want to avoid misconduct, you want to have economic benefit, ideally improve the supply chain working together, you want to have this both for the buyer as well as for the supplier. Let me be honest, this is a bit unspecified here on how this would work, and that would be now a typical hint, and that is also what we explained in the paper. This is a point where future research is needed. So it's a typical prediction and a typical consequence of looking at the literature that we point to. There's more to be done, and please folks, go for it. There's an opportunity.